Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 102 of That's a Good Question. The election, abortion, Trump, Durham, Ukraine, J6. How do we discern this month's headlines? Welcome back to our monthly edition of That's a Good Question. We were chuckling just before we began recording the long title for today. When you record, after our 100th episode, we decided we were going to record on a monthly format instead of the weekly like we had been. And one of the side effects of that is that there is a lot to cover.
Right.
And this month, especially busy being an election cycle, heading right into an election. So there's the war that's going on in Ukraine. There's the legal travails and maneuvers of our former president reaching their crescendo. So you've got all of that going on to make this an especially busy month in the headlines. So we'll try to cover the topics as best we can in a reasonable time frame. So let's get right into it. And we have an election, as I said, in a few weeks. Yeah. So what thoughts can you provide to our viewers, our listeners, as Christians, for us to approach the election with?
Well, we have something on the ballot this year that directly and profoundly implicates the abortion issue, and that's Proposal 3 here in Michigan. Now, remember that a proposal can be put on the ballot during any election by the action of the people if they garner enough valid signatures. I think it requires 400,000 signatures, and they have to be perfect. There can't be any duplicates, can't be any misspellings, so they're checked over very carefully. And they're checked over allowed to be checked over by people who oppose the proposal so that they can spot things. And if any of that happens, duplicates, misspellings, then the signature is disqualified. Proposal 3 got more than enough, but it was challenged in court by Right to Life of Michigan because Right to Life claimed that the proposal, now not the signatures, but the actual proposal had misspellings and it had duplicate lines that made it confusing. But the court rejected the challenge, and so Proposal 3 is on the ballot. Now, the reason Right to Life was involved is because Proposal 3 is about abortion in the wake of the Supreme Court earlier this year overturning the nearly 50-year Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade.
Yeah, so now Roe v. Wade overturned means that the abortion issue is given over basically to the states, right?
Yeah.
Each state deciding in their own laws how to handle this, right?
That's true mostly, that each state will decide what the laws governing abortion in that state are going to be now that Roe has been overturned. But at the national level, Democrats, with President Biden's support, are proposing a law to make abortion legal across the country. So really to go back to what we had with Roe, but do it this time by legislation rather than a court decision. Now, I don't see that happening anytime soon because it would require 60 of 100 votes in the Senate. It's hard to see then when they'll ever be able to get that many. They could maneuver it so that it requires only a bare majority, but there would be a tumultuous uproar if they do that. But it does show that it's still important to vote pro-life on both the state and the federal levels.
Arguably more important.
Yeah, that's right. Because now you've got both going. You got the state and the federal level.
Yeah.
And it's in our hands now. Proposal 3 is designed to ensconce abortion into Michigan's state constitution so that it cannot be changed by the legislature. It would require a constitutional amendment in Michigan in the future in order to change it. And that's a high bar to clear. Now, for the pro-abortion side, they need this amendment that Proposal 3 would create in order to offset what will otherwise happen, namely a 1931 law in Michigan that outlaws abortion in all cases except to protect the life of the mother. That would go into effect.
Okay, so with Roe v. Wade overturned, abortion is no longer viewed as a right guaranteed by our federal constitution.
Yes.
Like Roe had claimed. Right. So since it's not a right, it can be banned by a state if that state so chooses. Exactly. And many states like Michigan had it on their books
Right.
back in the day.
Yes.
Before Roe was decided in '73, that the laws prohibited abortion. So in Michigan, did you say the year? It goes back to 1931,
Yes.
and should have become law right after Roe was overturned. Why didn't that just take effect?
Because last month, a state court here in Michigan, a state court judge declared that 1931 law is a violation of the Michigan Constitution. So now it's been put on hold. So that is barred. The 1931 law had kind of an injunction, a stay, it's called, against it. So prosecutors won't be doing their work based upon that law. It's had a stay issued by the court, and it awaits. Yes.
I was just going to say a question back about something you said earlier, and this may take us off a little off track. But the proposal 3 is effectively going to place something as a part of our Constitution.
That's right.
And then you mentioned to remove it would take a constitutional amendment.
We have to do kind of the same thing.
So either another proposal,
Yeah.
or normally the process would be the legislature.
Yeah, and in Michigan, honestly, I don't know exactly what the Michigan legislature has to do to amend the Constitution, but I'm sure there's a provision in the Constitution for the legislature to do that. Just like in our federal Constitution,
Right.
the Congress can do it, or the people can do it, and then it has to get the states to ratify it.
And in both cases, it's intentionally a high requirement to meet.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. Yeah. So now this law, this 1931 law, awaits the fate of Proposal 3, which, if passed, will nullify that 1931 law. If Proposal 3 does not pass, then that 1931 law is going to be challenged to the Michigan Supreme Court, who could rule that it violates our state constitution, like the lower court in Michigan did. So it's important to vote for pro-life judges at the state level as well, because now that this is back at the states, not just does the legislature play a role, but now the state courts play a role as well. We sent a 3-minute video to our congregation last week that was put out by the Alliance Defending Freedom, in which one of the ADF attorneys outlined 7 very negative effects that Proposal 3 would have. And I encourage folks to watch that, and I encourage you, based upon what was said there, to vote no on Proposal 3.
Well, we're in the campaign commercial season, or so I hear. I don't watch a lot of commercial television. So that you just turn on your TV or you turn on your radio, social media, you're just inundated with ads, including ads about Proposal 3.
Exactly.
And, you hear pros and cons, and also you hear about our gubernatorial race in Michigan here. So incumbent Gretchen Whitmer running against Republican challenger Tudor Dixon. And it appears from what one would see on the airwaves and in the latest polls that these attacks on the pro-life side are having their effect.
Yes.
That, the scary warnings about the extremes and the circumstances with abortion that wouldn't be treated favorably, rape or incest, that those are scaring people. Those are winning the
I think
day.
so, yeah. I get that same impression that the pro-abortion side is winning the air war, as I'm not seeing the pro-life side do much to defend its candidates against those charges of extremism. It's almost as if, and here's the weird thing for me, it's almost as if the pro-life side was caught flat-footed when Roe was overturned.
Yeah, I mean, it just didn't have much time to prepare
I
for
know,
that, right?
only like a half century,
Right.
to prepare. And if you say, now, I was talking with someone recently about that very thing, and they said, well, they never thought it was going to happen, after that long. Okay, but okay. But remember, we had the draft of this decision leaked like 4 months before it actually came out. So if nothing else, you had 4 months notice that this was coming down the pike.
Yeah. I feel like there are good messages out there, but they're not mainstream. They're not messaging or sources that the general public's going to hear.
Yeah.
So what could be said to then, so someone's talking to their neighbor, their friend, relative, to soften the pro-life stance while still being true to the pro-life position?
Well, I highly recommend an article on this subject from this past May by David French of the Dispatch, someone that our listeners would be familiar with, only for no other reason because we talk about him a good bit. We've recommended the Dispatch in the past. I do so again, but I remind you, it requires a subscription, but I think it's worth it. David's a Christian, he's pro-life, and he wrote that May article with this title, For Abortion Abolition Against Abortion Abolitionists. And the subtitle says, if Roe is overturned, the path to ending abortion does not include prosecuting moms. And he points out that it's always been the position of the major pro-life groups that they are not out to punish women, but rather to save lives. But do we think that message has been getting out? I don't quite see that. I think most people don't know that that's actually the majority pro-life position. Now, in our Sanctity of Life service in January, I want to lay out the reasons that we say that. So mark your calendars for January 22nd of next year to either attend in person or to listen if you're outside our area. But for now, in May of this year, the nation's leading pro-life organizations, including Americans United for Life, National Right to Life, the Susan B. Anthony list, they together issued a letter to all state legislators saying this: as national and state pro-life organizations representing tens of millions of pro-life men, women, and children across the country, let us be clear. We state unequivocally that we do not support any measure seeking to criminalize or punish women, and we stand firmly opposed to include such penalties in legislation. The need for that letter was, in fact, urgent back in May because, for example, in the state of Louisiana, in the light of now the overturning of Roe, or the anticipated overturning of Roe, they were debating a law that would have permitted prosecution of mothers who obtained an abortion, and that had passed out of a committee in the Louisiana legislature by a 7-2 vote. Then after they got this letter, the bill's sponsor removed it from the Louisiana House calendar. That effectively killed it, but at least for now. David French says this: the logic of this would lead to criminalizing a woman who aborts, for example, an ectopic pregnancy. And there's been a lot of discussion about, well, what about it? And the pro-life movement, by and large, from what I have heard, have just not done a good job of answering this, I don't think. And so he says the logic would lead to criminalizing a woman who aborts an ectopic pregnancy, cruelly putting her in the position of choosing between prison and death.
To be clear, you're not saying that abortion is anything less than the taking of an innocent human life, right?
Yeah, thank you, for sure. You know, every abortion, for whatever reason, at whatever time in the pregnancy, is the taking of a human life. It is homicide. But we need to remember this. Not all homicide is a murder. For example, taking the life of another in self-defense is a homicide, but it's not a murder. And the law rightly distinguishes between act and intent. And it distinguishes between homicide and murder. And we should too. The pro-life movement has never been about punishment, but rather about life. And it's amazing, and it's really dismaying to me that this point has not been made more widely and forcefully.
Yeah, you said we need to vote pro-life for pro-life judges at the state level. So how does one go about doing that? You know, it can be very confusing figuring out who's pro-life. How do you tell that? What do you see happening? So that's the question for you. And what do you see happening in our elections a few weeks from now, both in our state and around the country?
Yeah. Well, we have a relatively easy way to be guided in how we vote here in Michigan, at least, because we have two major newspapers, and they have two opposite political perspectives in their editorial rooms. Mm-hmm. The Detroit News has been and is more conservative. The Detroit Free Press has been and is more liberal. Now, each issues endorsements every election year, providing their choices for governor and attorney general, secretary of state, state house and senate, and judges, and on the three proposals that are on the ballot. I recommend, as I already have, a no on Proposal 3, and making that recommendation very directly, even as my role as pastor, because it's a moral and biblical issue. On the other stuff, I encourage you to look it up.
Yeah, we don't make it our practice to say vote this way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I encourage you, though, to look it up and perhaps use the major paper endorsements and their explanations. As for what it's worth, I do, and I have done for many years. But what do I think is going to happen? I predict a Democratic sweep in Michigan for governor, for secretary of state, and for attorney general. And I personally think that's too bad because Whitmer and Benson and Nessel are all liberal and will do what they can to promote a morally, and that's what's most important to me, a morally, not economically liberal agenda. That's not what's most important to me. A morally liberal agenda, including on abortion, but also on the LGBTQ agenda and its promotion in our schools. But, what can you really expect to happen when you have really a kind of debacle on the Republican side?
Yeah.
I mean, and no one has really heard of, prior to the last few weeks, the Republican candidate for governor in Tudor Dixon. Now, she may have won the nomination anyway, but I just remind people that during the primaries, the Republicans earlier this year had, I think it was 5 of their 9 candidates disqualified because of invalid signatures on petitions. And most or all of those 5 had hired a particular company to do these petitions for them, gather these signatures. And this company turned out to have obviously done a bad job. It meant that some other, a bit more well-known and experienced candidates didn't get on the ballot. And so now we have Tudor Dixon.
It'd be great if on the Republican side we'd be spend a little more time thinking about election integrity and stuff like that.
Well, there you go.
It's kind of ironic.
It is, isn't it? Isn't it? And here we are. And speaking of that, the Republican Secretary of State nominee is an election denier and would be, if elected, would be in charge of our elections. Now, the truth of the matter is you just cannot have someone in charge who only accepts the outcome when they agree with the outcome. And yet that's what we've got a lot of people doing. On a national level, you have gubernatorial races in battleground states. Yes, Michigan, but Pennsylvania and in Arizona. In Pennsylvania, you have a guy in Doug Mastriano who's a Christian nationalist and who I think is going to lose because I don't know what else to say. Honestly, he's like crazy. I mean, I hate to, but it's just I can't understand how a guy like that can get the nomination and how this guy could be a serious candidate. And I think he's probably going to lose. And in Arizona, you have Carrie Lake, who's an election denier, but she's in a neck-and-neck race with her opponent, and that one could go either way. You have a battle for the U.S. Senate going on, which is now 50-50, but it goes to the Democrats because the tying vote goes to whoever the vice president is, which is, of course, Kamala Harris. So that is in the balance. In Pennsylvania, the Republican nominee is Dr. Oz. I mean, think about Dr. Oz, what are his qualifications other than Donald Trump likes him on TV and he endorsed him. Same thing with Carrie Lake in Arizona. She was a local TV anchor for many years. He liked the way her telegenic presentation, and so he endorses Carrie Lake, and so now she's Georgia, Herschel Walker. Herschel Walker. And in the last few weeks, the accusations with regard to him and his private life. And then the guy, I mean, I don't know whether those are true, right? I don't have the proof as to whether they're true. They're troubling, but I don't know if they're true. But he doesn't have the presence of mind to avoid, just within the last 2 days, getting up at a political rally with 2 sitting U.S. senators behind him to promote him, Republican senators, because they desperately want him to win because the Senate hangs in the balance, control of the Senate. So you've got Tom Cotton from Arkansas there, and you've got Senator Chris from Florida there, and these 2 guys are having to stand there while Herschel Walker, in the midst of all of these accusations about children that he didn't care for, and then about encouraging to have an abortion. He tells the story. Did you see this? He tells a story about how, and his point was, sometimes you want something, grass looks greener on the other side, but he tells a story about, there's this bull, and he's in a pasture with 6 cows, and 3 of them are pregnant. Already we're 3 of them are pregnant, and then he adds, so he has something going on. And kind of smiles. And then the 2 senators are back there. And if I'm one of those senators, I'm just cringing. Where's this going to go? And then he concludes the story by saying he wanted to go over because there were other cows over on the other side, where I take it to mean He can keep things going on, only to find that those are bulls as well. And the moral is sometimes things are not better over on the other side. I'm telling you,
Wow.
Okay, here's your candidate for Senate in the battleground state of Georgia. You've got Blake Masters, an election denier, and just a really right-wing kind of guy in Arizona. So the Republicans still, despite all that, will probably take both the House and the Senate, which they had lost both of under Trump. But this is an off-year election with inflation as high as it is, with a war going on, with a fairly unpopular president at the top of the other party. Mm-hmm. This should not even be a question.
Right.
But it is in question because of such horrible candidates. And to be perfectly blunt, that's thanks to the MAGA world. That's thanks to Trump endorsing these people. They become the nominee, and now it's in question as to whether or not they can get elected. And then having gotten elected, that's just putting aside if they get elected. How does Herschel Walker govern? What does Herschel Walker do? What's Kerry Lake going to be like as the governor? Okay. So I said earlier it would be a very long time before a national law could get past the Congress to make abortion a right across the country. The one caveat to that is if the Republican Party completely implodes, as it could, depending on what Trump and his MAGA friends do the next couple of years. If we keep doing this kind of thing, then the party itself is going to implode. That's going to leave it to the Liberal Party.
Yeah.
And then they may be able to have their way.
Yeah, who also is
It's a
both
mess.
sides seem
It's a
very
mess.
very much a mess. Yeah. So speaking of former President Trump and friends, what's the latest with his legal troubles?
Well, there are so many, really. It's sometimes hard to keep track, isn't it? He has the ongoing investigation in Georgia for pressuring the Secretary of State there to get more votes. Remember the infamous phone call, hey, I just need 11,000 more votes, guys. He has the New York investigation into his company's finances, where the Trump organization and its directors, including his sons and daughter, were indicted for fraud. Just as an aside here, that here is a man and his family who had a foundation, the Trump Foundation. It was a philanthropic foundation. It was sued for fraud several years ago. They settled this suit for fraud because the money that was supposed to be going for charitable purposes was not. And so as part of the plea agreement, our former president cannot sit on the board of a charitable foundation. Wow. How damning is that? I mean, if I want to start a charitable foundation, I could start a charitable foundation if I had any money, and I could sit on the board of the thing. You could be on the board with me, okay?
I think for our office, if we had that happen to us, we'd be disqualified.
We'd
right?
disqualify. I mean,
above
it's
reproach.
Just, okay. Yeah. Anyway, I mean, okay. So he's not a pastor. I understand that, but the fact that you're not allowed to. All right.
Not trustworthy enough is what that's saying.
That's what it's saying. Yeah. Just this week, in another case, a judge ruled he has to testify just this week in a defamation suit filed by a woman who claims that he raped her many years ago. Now, this particular suit is not about the alleged rape, but about his defaming of her. So contrary to popular comment, it's not about something that happened decades ago, but actually something that happened just a few years ago, namely him defaming her publicly about it. And then he has the J6.
I just, when I hear that situation come up, I mean, I immediately think back to the 90s and what I said, what I thought about a president that had these kind of accusations coming at him from every direction.
Yeah, it's all changed now, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Sad.
Right. And he has the January 6th investigation at the Department of Justice. As we talk right now, as we speak, as we record, the January 6th committee in Congress, not to be confused with the January 6th Department of Justice investigation. The one is a political, fact-finding. The other one is legal fact-finding and can prosecute. But that January 6th committee in Congress is meeting. And, in fact, just before we started, just voted to subpoena Trump himself.
Wow.
To come before the committee.
Speaking of the 90s.
Yes, exactly. That's right. I would suggest that as you think about January 6th, friends, that we cannot say we're pro-police and at the same time be pro-attack on the Capitol. I don't know how you can be both of those. If we say that African Americans would not likely be killed in the numbers that they are by police if they simply complied with orders. And by the way, I personally agree with that. I think people ought to be taught, I don't care who you are, to do what you're told when a police officer tells you to do it. And I think that would result in far fewer altercations. Well, then how can we say that Ashley Babbitt is a hero? And Ashley Babbitt is, and former President Trump has said this many times, she's a hero, and it's tragic, and she's a victim, in fact. Here's a woman who was literally trying to break into the House chamber while being told repeatedly to halt. She attempts to climb through a broken window, and she's shot and killed. So how can we claim on the one hand, if you just comply, but she doesn't have to comply and she's a hero? And if we do that kind of thing, it makes us contradict ourselves. It comes back to a theme we always talk about.
All while complaining of a two standards of justice.
Yes, and it harms our credibility as Christians. Now, we like to think of ourselves as pro-police until the police, and by the way, that includes investigators like the FBI, search and arrest someone that's on our side, and it just can't be that way. And then there's, of course, the ongoing Mar-a-Lago issue. And just yesterday it was reported that the former president ordered a staffer at his home at Mar-a-Lago to move boxes from one supposedly secure location to another non-secure area in his home. But here's what's important about that. That was after telling investigators these were secure in the original location and being told to leave them there. He tells somebody to move them, and they get it on video. They subpoenaed the surveillance cameras, and they have this guy moving, and now the name of the guy who did it has been reported. That's called obstruction, and it's one of the 3 laws that the Department of Justice used to get a search warrant for that August 8th search that they did. And this was all after one of Trump's attorneys signed an attestation back in June. Hey, we turned everything over. All the documents you requested have been turned over, which that August 8th search showed to be completely false. That attorney who made that attestation now has an attorney and says yet another attorney is the one who told her to do it. So now they're pointing fingers at each other.
Wow, that does not sound like it's going in a helpful direction for them.
No.
So will Trump be indicted for any of this?
Yeah, he will be. Okay, that's me going out on record. Yes, he will be. He will be indicted on the Mar-a-Lago documents, quite possibly on the January 6th attack on the Capitol.
When do you think it's going to happen?
It's interesting because I can answer almost definitively. I say almost because, of course, I can't know for certain what prosecutors might do, but I can say almost definitively that it will not happen before November 8th, the date of the election. And that's because of a Department of Justice unwritten policy that you don't make legal moves that could affect an election, if at all possible. And I would be beyond shocked if the Department of Justice violated that in this case. I'm that confident in saying this, despite what some of our listeners think about the Department of Justice and about the FBI and about the so-called deep state. For the most part, no, almost always, they play by the rules. There are exceptions, but they are rare, thankfully.
Have there been exceptions to this unwritten rule to not make legal moves when coming close to election? Can you think of any?
Well, the most recent was by the FBI against Hillary Clinton in 2016 and her emails. Remember that whole thing for the long time about her emails and her having her own server. And okay, so they're investigating all of that. Then in July of 2016, and that's an election year, James Comey, then the director of the FBI, holds a news conference and says, we've looked into all of this, and she was extremely negligent. I think that's the word, or extremely careless. But there was some other standard for prosecution that he said she didn't quite meet, and people have debated that. That's debatable. Okay, so that was supposed to be closed. She thought, I made it through that, right? July. Now we've got several months before the election itself. 2 weeks before the election, he reopens that because new information had come his way. And that may have, we can't prove it, but that may have cost her what was an extremely close election. Related to this, but as an aside, I heard just this past week an interview with Dan Abrams. Dan Abrams is a guy who's like all over the place, man. He's like he's the legal correspondent for ABC or one of the networks. He got his start on Court TV during the OJ trial.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
Dan Abrams. And he's written a bunch of books about the Kennedy assassination and a bunch of things. Very interesting guy, very thoughtful guy. He was being interviewed for a couple of hours on C-SPAN. Yes, I'm putting a plug in for C-SPAN. I'm one of the 5 people in the country.
Are there any election commercials on C-SPAN?
And there are no commercials.
All right.
There you go.
All right, I could get into that.
Commercial-free
There we go.
C-SPAN. And they do this thing called In-Depth, like once a month, and they'll take an author or somebody, and they'll take 2-3 hours to just focus on that person, and it was him. But they had to call in, and somebody called in and said, to the effect, hey, what do you think about the deep state and the FBI and all of that? And he says, you know what, I might disappoint you, but I actually believe in law enforcement, and that includes the FBI. And he said, with regard to the Russia investigation, and this is what just caught my attention, because I've hardly heard anybody say this. He says, one, it was Hillary that the FBI voted protocol on, that we just talked about, in reopening her investigation just 2 weeks before. But secondly, and this is the big point that I hear almost no one make, and that is if the FBI wanted to get Trump on the Russia thing in 2016, then all it had to do was leak the fact that they were investigating him for that very thing. No leak. None of us knew it. The election goes, he wins the election, he's inaugurated in January, and it's not until March of 2017 that the world learns that there's been an investigation going since July of the previous year. If the FBI wanted to get him, all they had to do was leak that, and he does not become president. So many of our listeners could have saved themselves a lot of hyperventilating had we just acted on those 2 facts. Hey, they went after Hillary in ways they haven't gone after anybody in terms of bringing this up 2 weeks before the election. And if they wanted to get Trump, they had a very easy way to do that. Now, the most egregious example was in 1992. There was a independent counsel named Lawrence Wall. She was looking into the Iran-Contra affair. You remember that during Reagan?
Yeah.
So this has been going on for years and years, and he was frustrated because he wasn't able to get, he wanted to get to Reagan ultimately, but he couldn't get to Reagan's people, let alone Reagan. So just days before the 1992 election, this is just very egregious, he indicts Caspar Weinberger, who had been the defense secretary under Reagan. So it's not going to happen, though, in this case, in the next month. I guarantee it. Because the DOJ and, frankly, Merrick Garland have too much integrity to do it if they don't have to do it. Barring some emergency that would require it, it will not happen until sometime after November 8th. But I believe sometime after that, yes, Trump will be indicted. And I tell you who else will not be indicted before November, and for the same reasons, and that's Hunter Biden. President Biden's son. A report came out a couple weeks ago saying FBI investigators looking into Hunter Biden's alleged misdeeds and very possibly real misdeeds, they think there's enough evidence to indict him. If there is, then I have every reason to believe that will happen. And if there is, I hope it does. Because no one's above the law, but I don't determine guilt based upon party. And so I don't care whether it's Hunter Biden. I don't care whether it's Donald Trump. I don't frankly care if it's Hillary Clinton. No one should be above the law. We should not determine guilt based on party, and none of us should do that.
Yeah, it could be, when you get into doing that, it could be disappointing politically for you.
Yeah.
But it's very liberating politically and otherwise for you if you just stick to the truth and the facts.
Amen.
And hold yourself accountable as well as the other guy.
Yeah.
So speaking of the deep state, John Durham is in action this week doing the work that he was appointed to do 3.5 years ago.
3.5.
To root out how the FBI concocted the Russia so-called hoax to get Trump. So what's he doing this week?
Well, I remind our listeners to go back and listen to episodes that we've done on Durham where we contrast his results to those of Robert Mueller. Robert Mueller met for less than 2 years, did his work in 22 months, and he had almost 24 indictments and convictions. We noted that Durham so far has one conviction, that of a low-level guy that was actually referred to him by wait for it again, the Department of Justice, part of the deep state. And he indicted another guy that no one's ever heard of. That guy was acquitted just a few months ago, and this week is apparently his last trial because his grand jury that he'd been presenting evidence to has closed up shop. It looks like he's going to conclude his work and then write a report. So this week there's a trial going on, apparently his last, seeking to convict a source of the Steele dossier. I won't remind everybody of that, but look it up if you don't know what that is, and accusing that guy of lying to the FBI. Now, remember, we've been told that, lying to the FBI back when it was Michael Flynn lying to the FBI, that's a process crime.
Remember, I'm a good student. Process
crime. I had never heard of that until we started making excuses for people lying to the FBI.
Yeah.
I am personally of the opinion that if you lie to the FBI, if you lie to investigators, that's a crime, and I don't have any adjective to put in front of it. Okay? It's a crime, and you should be prosecuted for it. And I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Now, if he...
I'm just when you said you don't have anything to put in front of it, I mean, I think of, again, our side when the term hate crime came into popular use, crime. So you didn't hate the guy and you still beat him up.
Yeah.
Isn't that just as bad?
So we say crime is crime, right?
Right.
Yeah, well, let's keep it that way. Let's keep it that way consistently. Now, if he wins this case this week, it will have frankly proven nothing that he set out to actually prove. If he loses... oh my, what a dismal record indeed. And remember, this was supposed to be the biggest scandal in the history of the country. That's what Trump said. That's what Fox News said over and over again. He was supposed to ensnare so many people. Let me read it for you. How many people, okay? He was supposed to ensnare former Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, former FBI Director James Comey, former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, former Associate Deputy Attorney General Bruce Orr, former Fusion GPS contractor Nellie Orr, former FBI agent Peter Strzok, former FBI lawyer Lisa Page, former FBI lawyer James Baker, former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, former National Security Advisor Susan Rice, former Ambassador to the United Nations Samantha Power, former CIA Director John Brennan, former Attorney General Loretta Lynch, and last but not least, former President Barack Obama. These are all people who were caught up in this deep state thing, and Durham was going to show it. So he will end up putting out a report. He'll make all kinds of claims in the report, I predict, to save face, but he was unable to prove any of it where it counts, and that's in court.
So last but not least, and I should say before I get to that, we should be careful. So if this was something that swept us away and we thought the other shoe's going to drop, and now this is, it's coming to an end and the shoe never dropped, avoid the temptation to say, well, it just proves how effective the deep state is. Right? Let the conspiracy grow stronger. Good because point. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's right. And so we hope that our listeners will step back and go, you're right, man. These guys were hyping that thing and said all this was going to happen, and it didn't happen. And so instead of saying that just shows how effective the deep state is, why don't we step back and say, maybe these people are lying to me. Maybe these people aren't being straight with me.
Because as you said, where the burden is really maintained, where their proof is really required in the courts,
that's right. Can't do it.
It couldn't hold muster.
Exactly.
So, yeah. All right. So last but not least, we have a war going on in Ukraine. And war is always a horrible thing.
Yes.
So as Christians, we care about it just for no other reason, humanitarian reasons. But there are other reasons that this is important topic to us as well, right?
I think we should be very grateful that Putin has failed miserably in his plan. And his plan was, yes, to take land in Ukraine, but his long-term plan, has been to divide the West, weaken the West. And that includes then weakening organizations, Western organizations like NATO. And he has been trying to do that for years. And for some reason, he has found a sympathetic ear with people that in the past, as I have grown up as a conservative, were very supportive of NATO, and very supportive partly because NATO was a defense against the old Soviet Union and now Russia. but it's found this sympathetic ear. So kind of a pro-Putin, anti-NATO approach. And I am glad that he has failed miserably in his invasion of Ukraine and in his plan to try to divide us on NATO. He's not only not divided us, he's actually expanded NATO as a result of this. So a couple extra countries have come into NATO, and Ukraine itself is now been given an application for and is being given expedited consideration as a member state of NATO. NATO is a great protection for us. It's a great protection for our allies. It's an international organization. And those are on the outs, unfortunately, with the kind of populist political environment we have on the right these days. But NATO has done tremendous good, including thwarting Putin's expansionist designs. But for reasons that are somewhat inexplicable, but I at least know one reason that I'll mention here. Right-wingers love Putin. And one of the reasons that they love Putin, and I've been trying to figure this out for several years, how did this happen? How did the Republican Party and conservatives, the Cold Warriors that we were, the anti-Soviet Union, anti-Russia people that we were the whole time we were growing up, how did they become so cozy with Putin and Russia and defending him? You know, like a Tucker Carlson does on a regular basis. They love him due to his Christendom. That he has, in Russia, wedded his government to the Russian Orthodox Church in such a way that he has created something that many Christian nationalists here in the United States long for, a Christian nation. Now, when we say a Christian nation, that means a form of Christendom, you know, with a veneer with laws. But of course, we know that real Christianity is something different than that, right? And so it shows up in Russia, shows up in a very stark way in the way they treat.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as Baptists, I mean, there's a reason that our heritage is separation of church and state. As Baptists, one of the tenets of Baptist doctrine, right?
And it always comes around to bite us, okay? When we try to wed the church to the state, we end up getting bitten by this. And that is what's going to happen down the road if we continue going this way. But one of the reasons they look at Putin as this hero of Christendom is because of the way homosexuals, for example, are treated in Russia. Now, homosexuality is a sin. Homosexuality is a sin that affects a country. It affects a society. It's a very serious thing. I mean, I know that. We've preached that. We teach that. I believe that. But how you treat people, I don't think our Christianity is shown in mistreating people. But that's what happens in Russia, and he's a big hero because of that, and he's a big hero with many right-wingers over here because of that. So in the run-up to the Ukraine war, Tucker Carlson condemned, quote, hatred of Vladimir Putin, and he famously asked on his show, has Putin ever called me a racist? Has he threatened to get me fired for disagreeing with him? Cancel culture. And in a podcast just prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Steve Bannon, former senior advisor to President Trump, declared, quote, Putin ain't woke, he's anti-woke. And then his guest, Bannon's guest on that show, Blackwater founder, a guy named Eric Prince, who, just as an aside, is the brother of Betsy DeVos, he said, the Russian people still know which bathroom to use. So you see what's going on here. Russia's got what we want as a Christian nationalist. And that's what many on the right are longing for. And David French wrote about that also this week, so another plug for David and the Dispatch.
All right, well, that about wraps up the headlines coming in the last several weeks since our last episode.
And next time, we will be post-election, so we'll see what has happened on November 8th.
So we'll invite you back to see our election wrap-up and any other news that's come up since then. So thanks for watching. We produce the That's a Good Question podcast once a month on the second Saturday of the month. And if you don't already, hit the subscribe button here below this video and like this video so other people can find it. And by hitting the subscribe, you'll know when new episodes come out. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.